Hello, everyone. Welcome to the David Peterson Public Leadership Speaker Series. And I'm Mel Kapp. I'm a professor in the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Let me begin with traditional land acknowledgement. We recognize that we are on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit. I'll tell you what the order of march is this morning or this afternoon or wherever you are, whatever time it is. We're going to start with Professor Savoie giving the lecture, although it is a taped lecture, so we will play the tape first. Then I will turn to Sean Laprairie. Sean is an MPP1 student. Sean will pose some questions to Professor Savoie, and then we will open it up for questions from the floor. So I will ask you during the course of this to pose your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom or at the top or wherever it appears on your version of Zoom. Then you can raise your hand if you wish, which is usually in the participants section. But with that, I am going to get out of here or out of your way. Let me begin, however, before I get out of your way, with an introduction to Professor Savoie. So Donald and I have crisscrossed and come into contact with each other many times over the years. But let me give you a bit of formality in his background. He is at the Université de Moncton. He's written over 50 books and over 200 articles. Several of his books have won awards. He's won the Donner Prize for public policy books. He's been shortlisted for the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for political writing, and he's got a whole list of other books. Most of his books are on the subject of institutions in Canada, be it the public service, political institutions, the role of power in Canada. And several of his books have described important accomplishments of public service and others. He's done some biographies like that of Wallace McCain, Harrison McCain. Wallace was his son. His latest book is called Democracy in Canada, The Disintegration of Our Institutions. And what is important here is reflection on our institutions. And Donald will address some of this in the course of his presentation. He was made an officer of the Order of Canada. I have run into Donald often when I was a senior official. I put him on one of my advisory committees when I was clerk of the Privy Council. He was on the advisory committee of the Order of Canada that I was on as well at the time. He has a DPhil from Oxford University. He has about a dozen honorary doctorates, including a D.Lit from Oxford. He was a visiting fellow at All Souls College in Oxford. At that time, I was High Commissioner in the United Kingdom and hosted Donald for some really interesting luncheon discussions around the evolution of public service and public administration. He was also then at the London School of Economics and has been a visitor at Harvard University. So this guy's been around. He is genuinely seen as one of the experts on public administration and public policy in Canada. And I look forward to this session today. So with that, let me ask Stacy to roll tape and we'll hear the public lecture.
I want to thank my friend Mel Kapp for arranging this lecture. Mel and I go back years, and we have had many lively debates. It is the custom to say that it is an honor to be invited to give a guest lecture. In this case, I not only say it, I actually mean it. It is indeed an honor to be invited to give the David Peterson Leadership Lecture. I have known David for over 20 years. I consider him a good friend. I also believe that history will deliver a positive verdict on his tenure as Premier of Ontario. One has to go back to former Premiers Bill Davis and David Peterson to see an Ontario Premier able to understand Ontario's special place in Confederation and willing to do something about it. Ontario is the one province that has a responsibility that extends far beyond its borders. Both Premiers Davis and Peterson understood this. David Peterson took a courageous stand that spoke to Canada's interests, not just Ontario's interests, when the country was trying to come to terms with its constitutional challenge. He saw the importance of political institutions. He took the controversial step of offering up 6 Ontario Senate seats in the name of national unity. He understood that the Senate was one institution that, if given the chance, could come to play an important role in dealing with long-standing regional tensions, which remains the #1 challenge confronting Canada. He paid the ultimate political price. David Peterson understood that institutions, be it the Senate or Cabinet, are better suited to deal with regional circumstances than an individual sitting at the top, surrounded by a handful of courtiers and posters. In short, David Peterson has always had a deep respect for institutions. It is only a fitting tribute that it is also the topic of my talk. We Canadians can be proud of how our national institutions operate, at least when compared to those in other countries. The Pew Research Center reports that some 64% of people across 34 countries do not believe that elected officials care what ordinary people think. In 1958, about 75% of Americans trusted their federal government to do the right thing almost always or most of the time. By 2019, the percentage was down to only 17%. Canada is, however, not without challenges. A survey of Canadians reveals that they have little trust in their institutions, that politics repels more Canadians than it attracts. In taking stock of our national institutions, I take no satisfaction in my verdict. My hope is that more Canadians will take a stronger interest in the workings of their institutions, call for change, and get involved. Douglas North wrote that institutions are the rules of the game of society, and the rules are devised constraints. The constraints consist of formal rules, informal constraints, and self-imposed behavior. Let's start at the top. Parliament. Parliament is today in a state of disrepair. Do not take my word for it. Members of Parliament themselves have been ringing the alarm bell for a long time. We now have a catalogue of reports, books, speeches produced by members of Parliament or recently retired MPs calling for reform. Party leaders have responded. They invariably pledge to give MPs a greater role, a greater say while in opposition, but little comes of it when they become Prime Minister. They very often do the opposite. Walter Bagehot, credited by many for having invented Britain's Constitution, saw 3 fundamental roles for Parliament: teaching the nation what it does not know, bringing matters to the attention of the nation, and holding the government to account. Bagehot's work spoke to both formal rules and informal constraints. I argue that Canada's Parliament is falling short on all fronts. I am not alone. Kelly Viaduc has the stern warning for those elected to Parliament. Quote, "It would be an enormous and probably fruitless task to argue that in the next 120 pages that Parliament matters," end of quote. John Ibiston, a widely read columnist, writes, quote, "Our Parliament has become the most dysfunctional in the English-speaking world, weaker and more irrelevant than the US Congress or the parliaments of Britain, Australia, or New Zealand," end of quote. He adds, "If Britain is the mother of Parliament, her Canadian daughter has fallen. Government MPs are cowed. Parliamentary committees are too often irrelevant." It is no exaggeration to suggest that the role of Parliament has been relegated to little more than making legitimate decisions that are struck elsewhere. It was not always so. In Canada's early years, members of the House of Commons were were less concerned about party discipline. They did not hesitate to vote against their party. And for example, 72% of MPs voted against their party in 1867. Debates in the House of Commons mattered. They actually led to the defeat of the Louis Saint-Laurent government in the 1957 election. Few Canadians, even MPs, would argue that Parliament brings matters to the attention of the nation. It does not. Social media and the 24-hour news channel now do. If a member of Parliament has a choice between raising an issue in Parliament or appearing on CBC Power and Politics or CTV Power Play, he or she will surely turn to 5 minutes on the 24-hour news channel, not Parliament. Fewer and fewer Canadians turn to their members of Parliament to voice their opinions or concerns. Recent surveys reveal that Canadians have little trust in their members of Parliament. Businesses are better able to bring matters to the attention to those in power. They hire lobbyists. A leading Toronto businessman recently told me, quote, CEOs no longer know who their MPs are, but they sure know who their lobbyists are, end of quote. Average Canadians cannot afford to hire lobbyists to roam the corridors of power in Ottawa on their behalf. Lobbyists know which door to knock on to have the concerns of their clients heard. Having access to the Prime Minister and his or her courtiers gives lobbyists a lucrative service to sell to potential clients. What about one of budget's most important roles for MP, holding the government to account for its spending? Thousands and thousands of pages are tabled every year in Parliament for MPs to review. However, little ever comes out of this process. Sean Murphy, the former chair of Parliament's Public Accounts Committee, exposed the problem when he met senior public servants. He told them to insert some blank pages in the budget documents they sent to Parliament to see if any MP would notice. He told them that none would. He reminded the committee that the Department of Justice simply, quote, forgot to include financial statements for their firearms registry, a controversial initiative widely reported in the media at the time. No one noticed, let alone raise questions about it. Sheila Fraser, who served as Canada's Auditor General, argued before she stepped down that MPs are, quote, failing Canadians in one of their most fundamental roles, the scrutiny of yearly spending estimates, end of quote. Lowell Murray, a highly respected cabinet minister in the Mulroney government, observed, quote, Parliament, specifically the House of Commons, over a period of more than 40 years, has allowed its most vital power, the power of the purse, to become a dead letter, their supply and estimates process, an empty ritual, end of quote. Political parties. At the risk of stating the obvious, representative democracy is not possible without political parties. Canada's political parties have lost their way. Public opinion surveys reveal that 94% of Canadians have little to no idea what political parties actually do outside of election campaigns, and 70% have a negative impression of parties. Political parties in Canada have lost their brand to their leaders. The Trudeau, Harper, and O'Toole brands are now what count at election time. Sophisticated political expertise, notably pollsters and political strategists, are required to develop and manage political brands. We are now told that candidates for Parliament are only worth, quote, 5% at election time. Canadian political parties do not have as clear ideologies as their counterparts in Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. A well-known Liberal Party pollster explained that this is important. Quote, parties don't run on what their members think and can't if they want to be successful. They run on what will get them the most votes. It is a strategic marketing exercise rather than a genuine contest of ideas, end of quote. Political ideology and the clash of ideas are no match for strategic marketing, political branding, and managing the election campaign. This begs the question, why would Canadians want to join a political party? Today's political parties have become little more than election day organizations, fundraising machines, and a convenient venue to select candidates to help them win elections. William Cross sums it up well when he observed, quote, Canada's political parties are not effective vehicles for policy study and development. They neither offer voters meaningful opportunity for involvement in the policy-making process, nor do they regularly generate policy alternatives for consideration and examination by those in elected office or in the senior bureaucracy, end of quote. Cross adds that the inability of party members to shape policies may well explain the sharp drop in party membership. The message to Canadians who want to influence public policy: join an interest group, not a political party. Cabinet. I invite those who believe that Cabinet still has Cabinet government to ponder this point. Quote, two key decisions regarding Canada's deployment in Afghanistan, one by a Liberal government, one by a Conservative government, were made in the Prime Minister's office with the help of a handful of political advisors and civilian and military officials. The relevant ministers of national defense and foreign affairs were not even in the room, end of quote. Cabinet was later told of the decision. Former Cabinet Minister Lowell Murray adds that this, quote, is far from an atypical illustration, end of quote. Some 20 years ago I wrote, quote, Cabinet no longer operates as a decision-making body, but rather serves as a focus group for the Prime Minister, end of quote. It is not too much of an exaggeration to write that Cabinet has now joined Parliament as an institution relegated to making decisions legitimate that are struck elsewhere or in the Prime Minister's office and a handful of courtiers. In the 2015 general elections, Justin Trudeau pledged to return Ottawa to Cabinet government. He told CBC's Peter Mansbridge that though his father launched governing from the centre, he would be the one to return Canada to Cabinet government. He boldly declared on the day that his government was sworn into office, quote, government by Cabinet is back, end of quote. In effect, acknowledging that Canada no longer had Cabinet government in 2015. However, government by Cabinet is not back. If anything, we have moved further and further away from it. Trudeau Fils has abolished the regional minister role for reasons that have never been made clear. This may explain, at least in part, why ministers have lost standing both inside and outside government in recent years. Ottawa has had powerful ministers down through the ages. They had their own brands and could point to major accomplishment that they had successfully promoted, which became part of their brand. I'm thinking, among others, of Clifford Sifton in immigration policy, C.D. Howe, economic policy, Alan J. McEachen, social policy, Lionel Chevrier, transportation policy, and Julie Lamarche and the Canada Pension Plan. I could go on. Only one brand is now tolerated, the PM's brand. Leaving aside the Minister of Finance, who always plays an important role in government, I challenge anyone to identify a minister who is known for something other than being in Cabinet. The public service. Peter Harder, who had a distinguished career in the federal public service, serving as Deputy Minister of Industry Canada, Foreign Affairs, and Secretary to the Treasury Board, suggested that if, quote, if the public service was now asked to ice a hockey team, it would ice 6 goalies, end of quote. Some of the problems in the public service are self-inflicted, but many are not. I also note that the challenge confronting the Canadian public service are also found in all government bureaucracies in Anglo-American democracies. I can hardly overstate the importance of the public service to Canada. If history has taught us a lesson, it is that countries cannot succeed and their economies cannot grow in the absence of a public service that can offer objective advice to their political masters, establish and enforce rules, collect revenues, and provide public services. More to the point, strong countries have a strong public service, weak countries have a weak public service, and countries in decline have a public service in decline. Canada has a strong public service and we should celebrate its success. However, we need to pay attention to the warning signs that have been surfacing over the past 40 years or so. I argue that policymakers made a bad turn when they sought to make public sector management look like management in the private sector. I have documented elsewhere the reasons why the effort has been a dismal failure in Canada. Suffice to note here that the public sector and the private sector are different in both important and unimportant ways, and that while the private sector manages to a bottom line, the public sector managers manage to a top line. In the private sector, you focus on earnings, profits, and market share. In the public sector, you focus on what the political class wants, the media, the blame game. Politicians today value public servants who are willing to assist them in marrying permanent election campaign to the art of governing. The goal to make public sector management look like the private sector management was doomed from the start, and many senior public servants knew it. But it was the fashion of the day which could not be resisted. I recall a senior deputy minister in Ottawa telling me, quote, "Politicians should heal themselves and heal Parliament before they try to heal the public service," end of quote. He had the right diagnosis. The goal sent a very powerful message to public servants. You are not as competent as your private sector counterparts. More to the point, the message was straightforward. Government managers can learn from private sector managers, but not the other way around. How then did policymakers try to make government management look like private sector management? The answer? Try to duplicate market forces and a bottom line in government operations. Program evaluation became the answer, and in 2006, Ottawa required all departments to evaluate all programs. It only takes a moment's reflection to appreciate that evaluating many government activities holds little promise. One senior federal government official told me that the role of government is to promote human dignity. Try evaluating the impact of government activities under this heading. Try evaluating the impact of federal government efforts to promote regional economic development. How can one possibly isolate the efforts from the value of the Canadian dollar, interest rates, the state of the national and global economy, and the list goes on? There is another issue here. Why would anyone think that federal public servants would want to produce clear, well-documented evaluation reports? Prime ministers and their courtiers are not asking for them. They also know that opposition party and the media will be scanning the reports to fuel the blame game. I can do no better than quote Doug Hartle. Quote, "It is a strange dog that willingly carries the stick with which it is to be beaten," end of quote. The result is that we have federal public servants kept busy turning cranks, not attached to anything. One deputy minister told me that too many of his departmental officials spend too much time feeding the bees or providing information, reports, and performance assessments to central agencies. Another line department deputy minister said that nearly 300 of the 700 employees were working on various accountability reports requested by central agencies and offices of Parliament. Many of these reports are of little value. Executives in the private sector are encouraged to take calculated risk, and it is easy to determine if the risks were worth it a few years down the road. Executives in government are encouraged to manage the blame game. There are well over 7,000 federal public servants working in central agencies for offices of Parliament. They do not deliver programs and services, and their purpose is to make sure that public servants in departments and agencies run on their tracks. We have made it exceedingly difficult to let federal government executives and managers manage. One ought not to be surprised then that if the public service was asked to ice a hockey team, it would go with 6 goalies. We have established the circumstances to ice 6 goalies. I spoke earlier about self-inflicted problems. The federal government does not have the capacity to redirect resources from activities that have long passed their best-by date to new activities. Whenever the government wants to pursue a new activity, the relevant line department invariably asks for new resources. No one in government, it seems, is able to redirect resources from low-priority activities to support new priorities. The public service has far too many management levels, an issue that the government admitted nearly 30 years ago and pledged to fix the problem. It has not. It has done the opposite by adding management levels. The Roman Catholic Church has 5 management levels from Rome to the local community. The federal government has 11 levels. This does not include the many associate positions that have been added, particularly at the senior level in recent years. Public service also does not have the ability to deal with non-performers. Senior public servants report that dealing with non-performers is too often time-consuming, too difficult, and too uncertain of outcomes to even try. The Clerk of the Privy Council and Secretary of the Cabinet admitted as much before the Standing Senate Committee on National Finance in June 2018. He called for changes that would make it easier, quote, to fire public servants for misconduct, poor performance, or mismanagement, end of quote. It is easier to simply sideline non-performers or move them to another branch or to other departments. In brief, the federal public service needs to explain why it needs 270,000 public servants to carry out responsibilities assigned to the federal government by the Constitution and put in place a stronger capacity to deal with non-performers to retain the credibility with Canadians. It has a choice: deal with these two issues or run the risk of seeing a populace come to power and take an axe to its ranks, or break all norms in dealing with it. The media. Representative democracy requires informed citizens, and informed citizens require media that supply them with factual information and knowledge. Stating the obvious, a well-functioning representative democracy and a free press go hand in hand. They are tied at the hip. The media are the fourth estate, a source of power or influence in addition to the executive, parliament, and the judiciary. Leading Canadian journalist explains that we are dealing with, quote, a crisis in the journalism industry, unprecedented in scope, a media implosion. Newspapers being reduced to digital editions, large numbers losing their jobs, circulation falling, ad revenues plunging. The old business model is in a state of collapse, end of quote. The shift from the traditional media to the new media has given rise to a post-truth world. Facts give way to the saying, oh, I heard it from someone or I heard it somewhere, end of quote. Social media do not lend themselves to in-depth studies and editorial control. As a result, they are particularly vulnerable to fake news and a reliance on stereotypes. President Obama made an important theme in his farewell speech to Americans, quote, increasingly we become so secure in our bubbles that we accept only information, whether true or not, that fits our opinion, instead of basing our opinion on the evidence that's out there, end of quote. Where does all of this take us? Canadians can take some degree of satisfaction that we have not maligned our institution to the extent that some other countries have. But Canadians need to guard against our institution becoming more ineffective and losing their legitimacy. When this happens, talented people no longer go to work for them or run for elected office. The results, our institutions become even more ineffective. We are seeing signs of this. We must also guard against an anti-institution bias taking root in Canada. Once it takes root, it becomes difficult to stop. A lack of social trust sets in, and we start seeing an unwillingness to accept the advice of experts in science. Institutions start to give way to powerful individuals, and again, we are seeing signs of this. There is a steep price to pay when all the talented people avoid public service for the rich rewards of the private sector. As The Economist magazine recently put it, quote, we run the risk of having a public sphere to carnival barkers and clowns. Canada is not there, but we must guard against going there. Un gros merci. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that lecture, Dr. Savoie. That was, of course, excellent. So at this point, I'll begin my interrogation. And of course, everybody in the who's watching is welcome to use the Q&A section to start submitting questions. So how this is going to work is I'll do my interrogation for about 15 minutes. And then after that point, we all spend around 15 minutes picking up your questions. So with that in mind, I'll get started. That particular description of the civil service is increasingly dominated by people who are essentially turning cranks attached to nothing was very sort of evocative, and it reminds me of a thesis by the regrettably recently departed anthropologist David Graeber, and he hypothesized that the economy is increasingly dominated by people where if you were to ask them in private if their job is fulfilling, useful, or even necessary at all, they wouldn't be able to say yes, but they would continue doing it. Now, we had a rather sort of salty phrasing for this, but if you applied this measure to your average civil servant, again, if you went and asked them in private, is your job useful, worthwhile, or does it deserve to exist? What kind of answers do you think you'd get?
I think it would depend on who I was asking the question. I think there is a fault line that we're starting to see in the civil service, in the federal public service. The fault line between people who are on the front line delivering services and people who are advising on policy, producing performance reports, producing evaluation reports. It's quite a dividing line. And there's a sense of frustration amongst people on the front line that they don't have the tools, they don't own their work. And I think it's much worse than it was, say, 20, 40 years ago. I think the reforms have made matters worse. Whereas at the senior level, these guys and gals are very, very busy. They put in 12, 13-hour days. They work hard. There's certainly a sense of frustration, but a sense of fulfillment as well. I'm talking about the deputy minister and the assistant deputy minister. So and they are quite busy. They have to manage the blame game, which has become even more important. And so to answer your question, if you're asking frontline workers, are you fulfilled? Are you happy at your job? Chances are the answer would be no. And we're seeing an awful lot of studies coming out to make that case. But if you're asking the question of senior officials, they would say they're working hard. There's a sense of fulfillment. They have a sense that they're making a contribution. So again, it depends at what level that you're asking that question.
And so you mentioned, of course, also those 6 goalkeepers. In other words, 6 separate institutions, all monitoring the civil service at the same time and in their own ways reporting separately to the PM. So this raises a question I have about your take on the nature of civil service malaise. Of course, you mentioned that there are both intrinsic and extrinsic factors, but in your mind, is the sort of preponderance of the problem the like internal to the civil service, or is it a result of this kind of almost sclerotic approach to management?
I think it's internal to the civil service, and I would go even further. I think it's much more pronounced in the Canadian public service. And I make the point because in Canada, we have about 11 officers of parliament, depending how you count, whereas in Britain, there's only 3 or 4. In Australia, there's 3 or 4. In the US, well, they have different sort of officers of Congress and so on. So we have 11 officers of parliament in Canada. We have thousands of people working in central agencies, and they go to work managing to make sure departments run on their tracks, managing the whole blame game. And so it is a shadow that you put on the shoulders of public sector managers. And I think the case is worse in the case of federal public service than it is in other countries. And it's certainly worse in the public service than it is in the private sector for all kinds of obvious reasons.
That's very interesting. And of course, again, just getting back to that, one key thing that you keep mentioning is this kind of, that there are several sources of, observation, all of which are kind of mutually contradictory. So obviously you have a clear problem with this kind of centralization of power, but then just to push around that a little bit, might it be possible that the problem is not the centralization of power, but rather the decentralization of the means by which it's enforced? In other words, would the civil service be more efficient if, again, it's still reported to a strong PM, but it reported to a strong PM through sort of clearly institutionally defined channels, in a sort of clearly thought out way, instead of through this series of various observers and halfway measures.
I would have to pursue that chat with you at some point, because I'm not sure how that would work. Are you suggesting that the 280,000 federal public servants would somehow report to the Prime Minister? And if that's the case, the bottleneck would be enormous. How would you manage it? So what would happen to ministers? What would happen to line departments and so on? So I'm not quite clear on what you're asking, but it warrants a good discussion.
Absolutely. On a slightly different topic, you mentioned that parties at present don't really run on what their members think. Obviously, I don't think anybody would disagree that Canadian political parties have been dramatically hollowed out. The days at which a party could easily depose a sitting leader are much like they're far gone. I don't think you get figures like, for example, Dalton Camp anymore, who can operate effectively as political figures from inside a party without taking elective office. So obviously this is dysfunctional, but, and for instance, we've seen this in the British Labour Party, is it not somewhat hard to square the circle between members of parliament as representatives of their constituencies and of representatives of the membership? Is there a tension there?
I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with a member of parliament saying, I have a conscience, I have a constituent, I represent people. I don't have a problem with that. Where I do have a problem is when they're pushed aside and parties are pushed aside, because we have these professional pollsters who march in and take over. The fact that they told aspiring members of parliament, and one of them told me this, he was told by a pollster, by a campaign organizer, you're only worth 5% of the campaign. That's an enormous message. And so the fact that a member of parliament wants to speak on behalf of his constituents, I have no issue. My problem is not there. My problem is with the professional pollsters and marketers who barge in and take over. And the focus is to grow the PM's brand or the leader's brand. That's what I have an issue with.
Absolutely. And so in regards to that, previously I'd heard a lot of complaints going around that people who have talent and ambition, they don't go into the civil service anymore, and they don't go into politics, they go into the private sector. Now, do you think that there's actually rather a push for talented young people who are looking to get into politics and make a difference now, to get into that kind of pollster role, to get into the sort of informal apparatus around these powerful politicians? In other words, they don't want to be Sir Humphrey Appleby from Yes Minister anymore. They'd much rather be Malcolm Tucker.
Well, that's a good line. Look, I regret the fact that young university students, the best and the brightest, don't want to go into civil service anymore. I regret that immensely, because I think we're going to pay a high price. I regret the fact that we don't have young, ambitious, young guys and gals who want to become politicians. I regret that. I recognize, however, that it's much easier to be a pollster, to be a marketer, because to go in politics now, it's really only for the brave. Social media, the fact that yesterday's news is never yesterday's news. We're making life so difficult for aspiring politicians that young people say, what the heck, I'm not going to go there. And that is a sad commentary. And I think over the longer term, we are going to pay a price. We've bashed the public service to such an extent that young university graduates saying, well, geez, I don't want to go there and be bashed. And so the point I'm making is that institutions do matter. They're terribly important. And the strong countries have a strong public service. Weak countries have a weak public service, as I said in the lecture. And I think if we lose sight of that, we lose sight of too much.
Now, of course, how to fix it, that's interesting to me as well. I know, for instance, in your book, you mentioned Pierre Trudeau as this kind of almost admirable antagonist, and that he really kind of screwed up the public service, but at the same time, he's your model for a strong prime minister capable of enforcing root and branch reforms. Now, at the same time, how do you convince a prime minister to give up their power? And as a follow-up, how would a prime minister actually be capable of conducting the kind of root and branch reform that you argue is necessary to save the civil service without using those same powers that cause the problems? In other words, how do you go about reforming the civil service on the political end without perpetuating the problems that currently plague it?
Very good question. I've thought about that question quite a bit, and I've come to the conclusion that we have to hope that at some point we are going to see a political leader, whether it's a Tory or a Liberal or whatever party, that will have the same kind of commitment to reforming the civil service, to reforming the government, the same kind of commitment that Pierre Trudeau had in bringing home the Constitution. It will take that kind of leader. It's not going to happen because it makes sense. It's not going to happen because we think it ought to. It's going to come from a leader that says, I see change, we need to do it, we need to embrace it. And until we have that, it's going to be an uphill battle.
There's, of course, your book focuses mostly on the federal government, and your lectures focus mostly on the federal government. First off, do you see these same patterns replicated in provincial governments? And second, I know that there's actually a lot of hype recently about the increasing sort of activism potential and dynamism of municipal governments as a force for democracy. Do you think that there's an opportunity there for a certain kind of bottom-up change?
Well, a former provincial premier, and not David Peterson, by the way, but a former provincial premier told me, I read your book, Governing from the Center. There's no other way of governing, is there? And he was serious. And so sitting in a premier and a prime minister's chair, you see the whole of government. You know that any moment you can have a crisis. You know that you have to make sure that things will run on their track. So it doesn't matter if you live in Ottawa, if you're sitting in Ottawa or in Toronto or in Fredericton, you want to manage, the blame game. We become so geared to it because it changes to the media and on and on and on. That's come to dominate. And the best way to manage the blame game is to have a strong center.
Now, just as a side note, we're getting some good questions coming in. Obviously, please, for everybody who's watching, absolutely keep them coming. We'll get to you in just a second. And then a final small question just about, again, the reform procedures. There's a political writer that I quite like by the name of Adam Gopnik. He writes for the New Yorker a fair bit. And he recently wrote an excellent book on political change. And his thesis is that large reform efforts by nature tend to be fallible. Of course, because the larger the bet you make, the more possible it is to get everything wrong. And so, for instance, his hypothesis on the reforms in the 1980s would be precisely that they tried to take it too far. What he suggests instead is, quote unquote, 1,000 small sanities. In other words, you take a whole bunch of individual, highly specific, fixable things, approach them one by one, and eventually it'll add up. So obviously you favor the larger approach in regards to the civil service, but would you then be able to name just for us a couple of small sanities that could be taken up?
I can give you an example of a large sanity. Margaret Thatcher shook up Britain. You can agree or disagree with how she did it, but she left a lasting impact on the size of government, on the civil service, on the economy. She had a tremendous, so she didn't go by small steps. She took a major step. A small step, look, I think some of the things that we've done in the federal government have been pretty good. We tend to overlook that. I think there was some efforts to move some of the units at arm's length in the 1980s and 1990s. They're still operating. They seem to be much more efficient. I'm talking about the passport office and a few discrete offices like that. So it is possible to take it in chewable chunks. Both can be tried, but I would remind you that Thatcher did go with the big chunk, and she did leave an imprint. She did have an impact.
Thank you very
much.
much.
Agree with it or not?
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much. So with that in mind, I think we'll open this up to a couple of audience questions. So for instance, we'll start off with Hugh Reagan, who's had his hand up for a while. Hugh, I'll unmute you, and then please unmute yourself and feel free to ask your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Savoie. Many of us on the call are policy students, and we spent our whole semesters learning about how governments can solve various problems. And as a result, I think many of us see problems out in the world and immediately think about how a government might start addressing that problem directly. And one of your books that you've written called "What is Government Good At" is presumably about why government shouldn't actually involve itself in solving every problem that we see out there in the world. And so can you talk a little bit about what you see as being the limits of government and how we can understand when government should and should not get involved in important issues? Thanks.
Thanks for the question. I think the lessons learned, there are a few things. One, successful politicians, successful premiers take on 2 or 3 major issues. I've been involved with several transitions at the federal level and at the provincial government level with incoming prime ministers and premiers. And the first bit of advice, it can come from me, from people who are much wiser than me, but I picked it up, that if you really want to have an impact, pick 3 or 4 things that you will want to do over the next 4 years. Concentrate on them. Don't be sidelined by issues. There will be crises, they'll have to be managed. But I think the lesson learned is that if you focus on 3 or 4 things, you have a much better chance of being successful than if you open the agenda to everything. That if you want to fix 101 things, it's not going to work. I think that's one of the lessons learned. For the public servant, I think you go into the department. I would welcome you young students. I would applaud the fact that if you want to serve in the civil service. My advice would be the first 2 or 3 years, learn the ways of government, try to work in a central agency, and then focus in the line department that really captures your interest, and give it a go.
All right, thank you very much. For our next question, another humble student of public policy, former Premier David Peterson. Feel free to talk. Thank you very much.
Can you see me, Donald?
No, but I can hear you.
Can I just say, Donald, I want to just tell all these students, I am thrilled that Don came up. Don, known for a long time. He's been mad at me on a number of occasions, but we have chatted about a lot of the big issues. And in my opinion, he's the most original thinker in this country today, and forceful and clear. And Don doesn't equivocate. And he knows, he's walked in the corridors of power. He knows everybody that's done it. So, and he has access to how this works. The story is a bit depressing from my point of view, Donald. You think we have to, is the only solution to find some charismatic leader that takes this on? And could you get elected if that was your only platform? I'm not sure.
Well, good to see you, David. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you for launching this series. As usual, you go to the heart of the matter. I think when I say 3 or 4 issues, I would look forward to see a leader that says, look, government is not working as well as it should. There's a consensus. I mean, people don't believe in government, don't trust government. It's true not just in the United States, but it's true here. If you look at surveys, they don't trust political parties. Parliament is no longer what it was and what it can be. And the civil service is not nearly as strong as it once was. So you're dealing with several institutions. And I would hope that someday a leader would say, look, we have a problem. It's beyond the civil service. It includes cabinet, parliament, includes all our institutions. Unless we do something with it, unless we fix something, or fix these institutions, the level of support that these institutions are going to enjoy is going to keep dropping. And at some point, it'll be a crisis. And so I understand if you go to northern New Brunswick and say, my goal is to fix the civil service in Ottawa, you get a bit of a yawn. I understand that. But I think the debate is going to be much broader than that. It's going to involve parliament, it's going to involve citizens, it's going to involve where they fit in the scheme of things, it's going to involve telling citizens, you could belong to a political party because it does matter. Unless we see that, we're going to keep drifting. That's my point.
It worries me that you're right. All these kids are going to fix it.
Well, let's hope so. I hope they will want to be, my hope is that they will want to run politics.
These are the best and the brightest, Donald, and they're all committed to public service, public life, and interest in it. So we have an advantage going in.
Well, that's great news. And if we have the best and the brightest that want to serve, there's no better news. Because if we don't believe in public service, if we don't see the role of government in a positive light, we are asking for trouble. That's my point.
Thank you very much. I believe Jamila Rashid has had her hand up for a while, so feel free to ask your questions.
Could you put back on mute?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry about that. So my question is, how do you think political parties can reform themselves to have a strong, coherent ideology?
Whoa, I would want to see them reform themselves to encourage Canadians to participate. That would be my first hope. In terms of ideology, that is for parties to come to terms with that. But my ideas of reform is to have political parties open up far more. That it's no longer the preserve of a few posters and senior brand makers. I think we're losing the democratic aspect of our political party. I would want to fix that, and the views, the policies, and the ideology will flow from that change. I don't think you start with an ideology and say, people, please join us. I think you let people join and then define what the party stands for.
Thank you.
All right, next up, Jessica Ryan. Feel free to unmute. Give me a sec. Yeah.
Hi there, can you hear me? I think, yes? Okay,
yep.
Great. So thank you, Professor Savoie. So I'm a public servant in the OPS, and I think I would agree with the comments you made in terms of the feeding the beast takes up a lot of time, and I think, frankly, a lot of time away from the good work we do in terms of developing policy and implementing it. I'm just curious, or I guess the comment I wanted to make though is I think that public service needs to do a better job of communicating the impact we make. And I think a lot of the feeding the beast is supposed to help our better communication, but also to validate that the investments we make really should be making an impact. But the question I had for you is what your opinion is on the role of the Auditor General in helping to play the role of ensuring that investments and policies that government makes are held accountable to the public and really are clear in terms of the impact.
Well, thank you for that question. Happy to answer it. I think the Auditors General have lost their way. I take great exception to a report from the Auditor General that concludes that the Department of National Defense is not ready to fight a war. I take great exception to an Auditor General saying that regional development policy has failed. I take great exceptions to Auditor General become policy actors. The role of the Auditor General was defined, should be defined as auditing the financial books of the government to make sure that everything is proper. When they go beyond that and become policy actors, to become politicians, it just adds to a voice, and it's not a legitimate voice on policy in my view. So thank you for asking that question.
Next up, I'm going to read out a question from Andrea Whiteley. Thank you very much for the question. And she asks, is it not in the interests of governments to have a large civil service which essentially guarantees votes from people who don't want to lose their jobs?
Cool. Can you run that question by me again?
Yeah. So So more broadly, I think that question, so the question was, is it not in the interest of governments to have a large civil service, which essentially guarantees votes from people who don't want to lose their jobs? And I think more broadly, that question does touch on a bunch of interesting themes from your book about the sort of difficulties inherent to actually sort of politically getting civil service reform done and the problems with the decentralization that you'd hoped to achieve.
Well, I think there's an issue in government, and the issue is how do you deal with non-performance? I don't think the public service has dealt with that. And I think it's incumbent upon public servants to deal with, not on politicians. It is their institution. And so senior public servants have need to address the notion that we have a number of non-performers. And non-performers hurt the public service in so many ways. It's costly, it's tough on people who do perform. So there's all kinds of reasons that needs to be fixed. But I underline the point, don't expect politicians to fix that. Because when politicians want to interfere in the running of the civil service, they will be told, back off, not your role. Your role is on policy. So they can't have it both ways. They can't expect politicians to fix that. So I think it's incumbent upon senior public servants to fix their institutions in terms of performance, non-performing individuals, and so on. There's several things that they need to fix.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So last question from Mel Cap.
Thanks, Sean. Donald, can you talk for a minute about the importance of politics? I mean, when I'm always struck by people saying, oh, that's just political, and they say it in a dismissive fashion, and they say it's bad. A lot of our regional development that you've become an expert in is dependent on that notion that it's just politics. Can you talk for a bit about the role of politics?
Well, Mel, thanks for the question. And I would start by agreeing with you. In fact, in the November update, fiscal update, we've just heard that they're creating a new agency, Regional Development Agency for British Columbia. Why on earth do we need a new regional development agency for British Columbia? I can assure you, and you would know this better than I, that the public service did not come up with that idea. I'm willing to bet my house on that one. And so politicians have looked at the positive of it and said, well, look, it would make political sense if we had an agency for regional development for British Columbia. At the moment, every postal zone, every postal code in Canada has access to a regional development agency. That's not what regional development agency ought to be. If it applies to every postal code, it begs the question: what is the policy not? So politics dominates so many things now, and you're asking the question because you know the answer. You've lived it far more than any of us. But absolutely, and politicians have every right to come in and say, we are going to do this. I don't have a problem with that. It is democracy. It is their right. They've earned it. They've run for office. They took that step that I've never dared to take and so on. So I give them full marks. What I don't accept is that when they come into office and belittle the public service, that I have a hard time with. In the public service, if things go wrong with that agency in British Columbia, for the love of God, don't blame the public service. And that's my point. They can make mistakes. They're elected to make mistakes, but they're not elected to belittle the public service.
Look, on behalf of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, Donald, let me thank you. This has been terrific to have your tour d'horizon of the institutions of Canada and the importance of them and the withering nature of them, and therefore a redoubling of our efforts to support the recreation and reinvigoration of those institutions of democracy. Sean Laprairie, let me thank you for standing in and posing your questions. And for the guy who Zoom bombed our meeting, the Honorable David Peterson, let me thank David in particular, the 20th Premier of Ontario, for having made this possible, that the Peterson Leadership Speaker Series is one of those premier institutions, if you will, in the Monk School, and we really thank you for your contribution to that. So with that, let me thank everybody for participating. It's 1 o'clock, spot on. And I want everybody to have a safe and happy and healthy holiday season. Thanks.
Can I say thank you, Mel? Can I say thank you for having me? Can I say thank you for David Peterson for doing this? Can I also say that I have a deep appreciation for David Peterson's work, because he never belittled the public service. He understood the importance of the public service. So it was a delight. It was an honor for me to give this lecture. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks a lot.